tonight. I'm Natalie Fritz. I am the Archivist and Director of Outreach for the Clark County Historical Society, and this is one of our virtual programs, which is what we do on local history or local history connected topics that we share stories with you, either from our archives and collections or with special guests like we have tonight. And tonight we have Diane Helentjaris, who's going to share with us about Lulu Bell Parr, who has connections to Medway, and she'll tell us her story of her search for her in the records, and to let us know how to break through that wall on record finding with some of that too. And she's asked we can hold for questions at the end if you guys have any questions for her. And I am working on two screens right now, so you're seeing me on my phone, but I also have the laptop here to control the slides. So Diane, I'll let you take it away and introduce yourself and get things started.
Sure. First, am I visible to people? Because they just turned the lights out in this room.
Oh, you are visible, yes.
Let me give me a sec to see if I can turn the light on. There it is. Oh, I guess it was a motion detector. I didn't move enough. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Diane had a power outage right before we started, so she's at the library to run this program. So
exactly.
We're still able to make it work.
Exactly. So my name's Diane Helentjaris. You can move to the next slide. Just to let you know my connection, my personal connection, I was born in Dayton. And when I was 8, I moved out to Medway and lived there until I went away to college and came back after my freshman year. So I'm a graduate of Tecumseh High School, for those of you in the area. You can do the next slide. And Lulu Bell Parr, if you don't know about her, she was a Wild West show performer. She probably had one of the longest careers in Wild West shows of anyone. She started out in 1903. She was 26 and worked well into her early 50s. She was a headliner for Buffalo Bill, Pawnee Bill, the 101 Ranch Show. And her deal was she started out as a trick writer doing gun tricks and the usual acting in the Deadwood Express holdups at the Wild West show. But then she went on to become one of the earliest female bronco riders. And that was what she mostly did. She rode broncos into her 50s and lived to tell the tale. So with the Depression in 1929, the bottom fell out on bronco riding as a career. And she didn't do very well in the last part of her life. She ended up living in Riverside, just that little area north of Dayton, along Valley Road, and lived with her brother. She had married 4 times and had no children. So she lived with her brother and his wife and her brother's 2 stepdaughters, and died in 1955 at age 78. She was extremely poor at the time. She was destitute and ended up buried in my hometown of Medway in an unmarked grave. So I knew nothing about her until a few years ago when I saw a post of the Medway Area Historical Association that Scott Souther had put up. And it had a picture of her and talked about her. And I thought that was kind of interesting to have a Wild West cowgirl buried in Medway at the Mennonite Cemetery. So I started doing research. And what I want to talk about today is mostly how I dug up her life story. And I think there's tips to that for other people who want to find out about historical figures, especially marginalized ones, or if you just want to find out about your family history and you're doing genealogy and come up to a tough time. So the goal for me in doing this research was to write a factual biography of Lulu Bell Parr. I didn't want to use creative nonfiction. I didn't want to make up dialogue. I didn't want to try to guess why Lulu did what she did or just make up stories. You know, I'm one of those people in a a lot of what I read, I want to know what really happened and then make up my own mind as to probable causes or motivations. So that was a goal. And you can switch to the next slide, Natalie, please. And this slide is just the cover of my book, which is the end result of the research. And I want to say, you know, when you're researching, writing, or anything, you have to decide that you've done enough. And there's always more to do. So this isn't the end of Lulu's story. It's just, I felt that I was at the point where I could summarize her life and make some sense out of it, and that other people would carry on after I did this work. And I also really believe that by surfacing what I have surfaced, other people will find other things to add. So if you want to do the next slide. So the first thing is organization. And I'm going to tell you how I organize my writing, and maybe you'll get some tips from that. There's a lot of ways to do it. I try to do as much as I can using information technology and using my computer rather than paper. I find it easier to deal with and certainly less messy, although there's some paper that you just can't get away from. So I want to maximize my electronic tools, my computer, my PC, my scanner, and then also set up a little paper file system. Also, when I'm researching historical figures, I do other writings. I write articles, and I've written at least one other book. You end up collecting, at least I do, ephemera, which need archival storage, ideally, to preserve them. So I use a small plastic portable file and a laptop when I travel, like when I came back to Medway to talk to people about what they knew about Lulu. I use a camera, and nowadays your phone is perfectly fine. And that's a quick and dirty way to collect your information and store it for later, and then sort through it and see if you need a more accurate copy. A scanner is really helpful. I use just a cheap photo printer that costs maybe about $100. It has a scanner, and that's totally adequate. The next part is software. I end up, for historical research, subscribing to newspaper archives. And these are digitized newspapers. I like newspapers.com for just a general one. There's another newspaperarchives.com that I've used. I use Ancestry to help with genealogical research. And to organize my writing, I use Scrivener. And Scrivener is a British software program. I believe it costs about $40 a year. And if you're a writer, or if you just have a lot of stuff to try to organize, it's really helpful. It's sort of like having a ring binder on your computer. So I set up categories. So for someone like Lulu Bell Parr, it might be Bronco riding, it might be the people like Buffalo Bill. And I set up an electronic file within the Scrivener software for each of these people. And then I usually start with a Wikipedia search. And Wikipedia can be inaccurate and opinionated and kind of trashy, you know, sometimes the assumptions, but it's a good place to start because they will often have documents attached that are your original documents. And it just gives you an idea what's going on. So I'll take the Wikipedia article, I'll copy that, and I'll paste it in my Scrivener file. When I find articles online or blog posts, I'll copy those along with the URL in that file in Scrivener, because in doing historical writing, you find you go back repeatedly to these references, and you don't want to have to look them up on your computer each time. It's easier to go into Scrivener, just open that file, and it's there. And I can highlight it and cut it and paste it. And I don't really worry about copyright for an article that's just in a file that I'm using, because I'm not publishing the file. if that makes sense to you. I also will use Scrivener to create a file of potential illustrations. If they're electronic, like from the Library of Congress, I'll copy their file numbers so that I can find them later, and then they're all in one place. And then also, I use a Mac. So in my photos, I'll set up an album. So I have an album for Lulu Bell Parr, and that has a collection of photographs of her that I can sort through when I need to. And let's see. I think, yes, I'm ready for the next file. So another way that I organize my information, and this looks pretty tedious, and I guess it was, but it was well worth it, was Lulu Bell was a performer for, let's see, 30 years. And to figure out what was going on in her life, I wanted to know where she was, because that was very helpful. There were claims that I found when I first started reading about her, where people said that, for instance, Teddy Roosevelt, she repeatedly said Teddy Roosevelt had congratulated her on winning at Frontier Days. And you don't know if it's true or not. And I'm pretty skeptical. So at first, I didn't believe anything. Okay, it said she met the president of Argentina, and I'm like, maybe, I don't know. Did she really? So putting it all together, I put a timeline, like where she was and who she was with, to sort of document, not sort of, but to actually document who she reportedly was working for. And we can do the next slide. And I did another document that showed, I guess the term is granular. So for instance, in 1908, her brother was living at 123, I think it is, South 3rd Street in Steubenville. And I put my source down, that it was the directory, and I put the fact down. And this helped me later when I tried to pull things together. I also, on my newspapers.com, if any of you have subscriptions to that, there's clippings where you can organize your clippings by topic. And the way I do it is, when I find an article, let's see, about Lulu, and I want to save it, in the description or in the title, I will put Lulu and then, Chicago, or Lulu voting, Lulu suffragette march, because she marched in a suffrage parade. And then because Lulu's consistently in the title, I can sort it by that as a category. Okay, I do the same thing with my photographs. I'll name them, I'll go in under descriptions and name them, like with Lulu, so that then I can sort them and they'll all fall out and they'll all come out together. So those are how I really work to try to make sense out of the information. There wasn't very much information at first that I could find about her that I trusted, and it was a lot of detail. So next slide. Okay, I started, I'm going to have to stand up to get the light to turn on. At home, the light stays on. I'm sorry. I started with what people knew. And I was very dependent on Medway Area Historical Association and Scott Souther for help with this part. They, along with the Riverside Historical Society, had collected a lot of information back in the early 2000s. And they did this as part of their efforts to put a monument on this woman's grave. She was in an unmarked grave. She had died a pauper. They raised enough money to do that, and also to put monuments on her, or at least a tombstone on her brother and his wife's grave as well. And then there was more research done to successfully get her inducted into the National Cowgirl Hall of Fame. So that information, I have to say, people were very generous and shared that with me and gave me like just an excellent start. And almost more importantly than the information that I got was to find out from Scott Souther places that he had gone where he didn't find very much, because he went out west and traveled around from place to place and researched stuff. And some of these places just didn't have anything about her. So I didn't have to waste my time going down, you know, dead end alleys. So, and you can do the next one, next slide, Natalie. So I started the hunt with what we already knew, and then I read associated information that you would expect, you know, your standard stuff, magazine articles, blog posts, books, where she's mentioned in books. And I looked at details because since there wasn't very much available about her, any little detail was handy. So this is part of her stationery, her professional stationery as a bucking horse rider. And up in the right-hand corner, she says who she worked with. She says she worked with Pawnee Bill, and she gives several years, and Buffalo Bills and several years, and that she toured in Brighton and Liverpool, England, and the date. And that's incredibly helpful because you can sketch out then her employment history. And Natalie, we can look at the next slide. And you can confirm it with other materials, or as much as you can trust a postcard. You know, this is a postcard where again, she's saying that she worked with Buffalo Bill and when she worked in Pawnee Bill and Brighton, the same stuff. So the story's consistent, at least in these two things. One of the challenges with Lulu Bell was, since she was a professional entertainer, to sell tickets, sometimes people don't necessarily tell the truth. You know, it's all about creating a fantasy. And the fantasy for the Wild West shows were that these were real cowboys, real cowgirls. They grew up on the ranches out west. They knew their way around a horse, and they could, you know, lariat and all that kind of stuff. And so Lulu, who was born in Fort Wayne and lived in Ohio, didn't really own up to that very often. And she would say she was from Nebraska, Wyoming, Colorado, San Antonio, any place but Ohio, okay? Because saying you're from Ohio didn't really sell Wild West tickets. So you had to sort through kind of that glitter that goes along with being in the entertainment industry. She also repeatedly lied about her age. She started out older than many of the people in the Wild West shows. Lillian Smith, who was a gunslinger, started at 15. Lulu Bell was 26. Annie Oakley started out younger than that as well. So she would repeatedly fib about her age, and she could pass herself off as younger. She was a fairly youthful looking person. And of course, she was in excellent physical condition from her work. So, so I'm reading this associated stuff, and I have some tips, which is you can read many out of copyright books for free online. You can also find the local library that closest to you that has them. And you can always have your library or ask them to borrow books from afar. So I've had my local history library borrow books from Kentucky and get them imported in so that I could look at them for some research I was doing. And it takes a little while, but it's well worth the effort. The other thing that as a way to husband your money is to not automatically buy a book. I like to have references at my hands. I'm not really good necessarily at returning them to the library on time, or I want to keep them for a while or use them over years. So if I think I want a reference book, I'll get it on my Kindle, my ebook reader first, and kind of look it over and use it. And then if I want to buy a copy, I'll try to buy a used copy often on eBay, someplace like that, because I really don't care if it's a little beat up. I just want the information. The other places where I looked for Lulu include vital statistics. For example, documenting whether or not she actually married this one man that she was supposed to marry in St. Louis. And so you have to write away to the St. Louis vital statistics folks and document that no, she never did marry that particular man. Family interviews would be a standard research practice. But with Lulu, she had no direct descendants, and neither did her brother. He had stepchildren, but they didn't have kids. So you lose those potential people who would carry on the family histories and be able to talk to you about it. So I didn't find it very helpful to try to run down people who might know, because at this point in time, there were like 2 or 3 or even 4 generations past her life, and they would be tertiary to her. So to call them up and say, you know, your grandfather might have ridden with Lulu Bell when she went to Florida in 1935. Did he ever talk about that? It's kind of tough. So I didn't find that very helpful. So as far as digitized newspapers, you have the free ones. Now you probably know about Chronicling America, which is a Library of Congress collection of many newspapers, and that's a really good place to start. It's free. Newspapers.com is a subscription service. It's pretty comprehensive. But each of these newspapers archives have a different selection. And so they just might miss the newspaper that carried most of the news. So for instance, for Lulu, she spent her teenage years and her early married life in Steubenville. And so there is a Steubenville Herald, but it's not carried by Ancestry. And I didn't really find it, I don't think, in Chronicling America, but it was in another selection called Newspaper Archives. So you have to play around with them. Different states also have free newspaper archives. You might not realize that. Colorado does, New York State does, California does, Wyoming. And sometimes they have very esoteric articles to find. Next slide, please. Natalie. Let's see. Okay. Another place to look for information is on the back of pictures, postcards, those little labels that people do. I know you can just find out all kinds of stuff on them. And then the next slide. Now, the challenge with Lulu Bell is I consider Lulu Bell representative of marginalized people. Marginalized people are those that are disenfranchised, disempowered, excluded. They're the people that some would say they don't count, they're not counted. That might be on the base of ethnicity or race or gender or sexual orientation or economic status or disability. So women, especially in past times, can certainly be thought of as marginalized. They couldn't buy property. They might not even get buried under their own name. I have a friend whose relative was buried as Mrs. John whatever, rather than her name. So it made it very difficult to find her. And Lulu was not a rich person. She had a 3rd grade education. Even as a big time headliner with the Wild West show, her standard salary in 1929 was $35 a week, which was only $10 more than if she were a man working in a factory on average. And it was less than people would expect of a theatrical star. Okay, so she never, although she was quoted as being the best paid Wild West performer, it didn't pay well. And of course, they only worked part of the year. They only worked when they could travel, which would be from spring through about up until around Halloween. So since she was marginalized, she didn't leave a lot of information behind. I didn't find census records for her for 1910, 1920, because she was probably on the road when the census people were coming around. I don't know that she ever owned property. I found places where she lived, but they may well have been rented. She often spent the off season hanging out with relatives, just bunking with her uncle or cousins. So with someone like that, it's difficult to find out what was going on. So if you think of her at the edges, to find her, sometimes you have to look at the center of her life. You know, it's sort of like her sun and her moon, who she is orbiting around. And if you want to go for the next slide. Okay, this is a family tree. You can sometimes find references in the newspapers where she's visiting an aunt or an uncle or a cousin, and that does help fill in her history. And then you want to switch that up, Natalie? There. So the family tree was real helpful in that I found a reference that said her great-grandfather was from Leesburg, Virginia, which is where I live. And I just thought, well, everybody's from somewhere. That's kind of interesting. So what, you know? Well, then I looked a little further, and this is a map of Leesburg. It's a recreation of the earliest map from 1758 or 50, I think it was 1758. And that's how they platted out the town when it was first set up. And we'll go to the next slide, Natalie. There you go. And if you look at a close-up, the area in green is the land that they had set aside for the courthouse. And that's where the courthouse is now. That's it on the left. And adjacent to it, around the corner, was Lulu's great-great-grandfather's property. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. You know, he actually was one of the early guys. Well, the more I looked, and you wouldn't think like something from 1758 would have much of a bearing on a person who was born 100 years later, but I find that it does. I think so, because what happened was this guy, William Fowkes, her great-great-grandfather, was a carpenter and had wanted to make a lot of money building houses in this town where I lived when it first took off. But he was a bad businessman and he failed. And rather than going back to Philadelphia where he was from, he made a decision. And you know, sometimes you make a decision and your family pays for it for generations. He decided to go to Pennsylvania. Next slide. And he went to Beaver County, Pennsylvania. And that's it in red. And he died plowing. And his children, like a couple years later, he had five children at the time, were out making maple syrup when the Wyandot Indians raided them, killed one of the children, and took two, which would be Lulu Bell's great-grandfather and her great aunt, and abducted them. Next slide. To Sandusky. And her great-grandfather lived with the Wyandot for 10 years or so, married a Wyandot woman, had two children. Her great aunt married another captive and had children and never left. Her great-grandfather did leave for political reasons. He thought they were going to be on the losing side of the upcoming war with the British, and went back to Pennsylvania, abandoned his Wyandotte wife, and married a white woman who bore Lulu's grandmother. But he always maintained his relationships with the Wyandotte. So he's back in Beaver County, Pennsylvania. And next slide. And Lulu's, he worked first as a spy against the Indians, and then was rewarded with land and built a mill there. And this is his mill. It's got a historic plaque, and it's, the mill's gone, but the creek's still there. And you can see he was very well thought of. Next slide. His home is noted, he was like quite the character because of his relationships with the Native Americans, and they trusted him, and he was fluent in, I believe, like about 6 dialects. He was a trader. He traded goods with them, and they came and they lived in his front lawn. They erected little, they called them shacks, but little wickiups or whatever, and just stayed there year round. And there was a lot of, back and forth. And then he would still go back to Sandusky and be helped by his adoptive Native American mother. So he had close relationships with the Wyandotte. Next slides. His sister, Lulu's great aunt, had excellent relationships with the Wyandottes, never left the area of the village. It's near Fremont. And in exchange, they gave her and her husband 1,100 acres, and 500 acres are still intact as a reserve. They are considered the first permanent American home in Ohio. So next slide. So I would think after, as far as that family history with Lulu Bell, by finding that with my genealogy study of her family, I think it gave some explanation for some of her choices as to costuming. She was quite comfortable with her Native American co-workers, and would claim to be adopted like her great-grandfather was, only she was adopted, according to her, by the Crow Indians. So that was very helpful. Another way is to look for her information was to look at her employers. So William F. Cody was one of her employers, and of course, there's tons of information about him. You didn't really find anything about her, but you could find information about what her work life was like, what it was like to travel, what happened to Buffalo Bill at the end of his career, and interactions, that he had with his employees, and his attitude towards women. Next slide. Pawnee Bill, researching him was very helpful. He was her mentor. She worked probably the longest for Pawnee Bill than anyone else. She started out with him, and he was a pretty decent guy. So you could learn a lot about what her day-to-day life was like by learning how he organized his shows. They would have hundreds of employees, hundreds of animals, transport them by train across the country, traveling like maybe 60 miles in a day, working 2 shows every day, 6 days a week, Sundays off, things like that. They really gave you a sense of what her life was like. Next slide. The Miller brothers, she worked for them as well, and was one of their headliners. And again, it was helpful. Next slide. So in addition to looking at her employers, I looked at her co-workers, and some of those were better documented than others. Lillian Smith, we had books written about her. She was an American from California. Her parents were Quakers from New England. And she at first worked with Buffalo Bill and Annie Oakley, didn't treat Annie Oakley quite right, ended up getting fired, and then came back claiming to be an American Indian. So her story was interesting and again, kind of filled in what life was like. Next slide. Bill Pickett was an African-American bulldogger. He started the sport of bulldogging, you know, wrestling these steers. And he went on the trip to South America with Lulu Bell. So researching him helped me figure out what ship she was on and kind of the details of that trip, because Lulu Bell did not leave a diary. She didn't leave an oral history. She just left a few letters, as far as I can tell. Next slide. Goldie Griffith was another cowgirl who worked with Lulu Bell. She was a few years younger, and she lived to be in her 70s in Colorado. And we were lucky in that she left an oral history. She sat down with some people in Colorado and talked all about what life was like when she was a young woman working in the Wild West show. So she actually mentioned Lulu Bell. She worked with her. I don't believe they got along real well. She described Lulu Bell as aloof, and it probably had something to do with the fact that Goldie had a crush on a man that Lulu Bell married, at least for 3 days. So there you go. Next slide. As I researched, I would find associated people. People were kind of tertiary, but still interesting. And this man, Samuel Spotford Clement, I found his name, and he was the constable who interacted with Lulu Bell when she was a teenager, and her mother and her grandmother, and got in an altercation with them, actually, because he was hired to retrieve some furniture that one of Lulu Bell's boyfriends had given her. Well, it turns out Samuel wrote his own biography as an older man, and that helped me fill in some information about life. Next slide. I want to talk about atypical sources. And researching marginalized people or people who didn't leave much behind, you know, of their life, didn't leave diaries, didn't leave oral histories, all that, you're kind of stuck. And yet I wanted to document what really happened. And I found, I've used ephemera for years to help illustrate stories. Ephemera would be things that weren't supposed to last, that were just kind of memorabilia, but somehow they made it through, like postcards, tickets to a ballet, newspapers. That's typical ephemera. Well, you can buy it on eBay and Etsy, and you can learn a lot. Okay, next slide. Here's a little Tavernet Inn ephemera to let you know. Next slide. So some of my most helpful information for writing the book came from ephemera. And it was kind of tedious. This is a glass negative that I found on eBay. I found 2 of them. And I found it by searching for Pawnee Bill performers. And there were so many entries for Pawnee Bill performers, I had to break it down into decades. It was something you do while you're watching maybe a football game and you're not watching the football game, you know, kind of sorting through there, looking around. And then I found this, and it's Lulu Bell. It was a photograph of performers between sets for Pawnee Bill. And that's Lulu Bell. And I believe that's Bessie Herberg, a co-worker with her. And I liked it because you don't often find examples of people at work and people doing those just tired, just tired and resting and not looking their best. She's got a Turkish towel on her head. I thought it was a great picture. And I bought the glass negatives and then had the local Photoshop make me prints. Next slide. Again, at first I was doubtful that Lulu had gone to South America. I didn't want to just accept it, that she had been on this tour. And then I found a passenger list on eBay. And a passenger list, it's a little souvenir booklet that's given out to the first class passengers. And it tells them when dinner is, how they can get their table mate changed if they don't like who they're assigned to eat with, when they can get their hair cut, all that kind of stuff, mail, how that's handled. And it had a list of all the passengers who were first class, they called it saloon class, and who they so you could find when they boarded the ship, because the ship picked up passengers, this one in Buenos Aires, and then Rio de Janeiro, and then I think it's Bahia and Trinidad, and then on to New York. So you could find out when they got on the ship and when they got off and who they were traveling with. And so I found Lulu traveling with the manager of the Wild West show and his family, and another performer, I think it was Beatrice Brasso, and the ship. So it gave me the documentation I was looking for. Next slide. Okay. This is the ship that she traveled back from England in 1908. And again, I found that these are very inexpensive, but they give you a sense of what life was like. Next slide. This is it's a luxury liner that she rode from South America. And this is what it's called, the Veranda Cafe. This was kind of the furnishings that she, at age, let's see, 30, she was about 40 then, that she got to enjoy. Next slide. This is some ephemera. It's a part of a newspaper, and it shows Steubenville, Ohio, early on when her grandfather was a steamship captain. Next slide. This is I got this again from eBay, and it's the menu of a ship she was on the night before she got on the ship. But it's still interesting because you can see the fancy food that they were eating and all that. Next slide. This is the program for 1929, the 101 Ranch Wild West show. And I really, very little was documented as to what happened to Lulu at the end of her career. And the information varies as to when she quit riding and where she went and what she did. And there's like a big blank in the 1940s and 30s. And this is probably this is next to the last time she was performing. But clear as day, she's listed as the leader of the Cowgirls in 1929. And she's like, I think she was 53, if my math is right. And she's still riding Broncos. Now, I had a conversation with somebody, like an email recently, and they thought, well, no, she probably only worked for a month or so. But there's more documentation in newspaper articles that later that year, she was in Bellefontaine, Ohio, and a reporter from Springfield came up and interviewed her. So in fact, she did perform for several months at least in 1929. Next slide. This is a picture of Steubenville, postcard. Next slide. This is a program. It's a big program. It's like a newspaper, several pages that Pawnee Bill put out. And I found this and I thought, I think that's a picture of Lulu. And she's standing by a camel. And sometimes you get these corroborating bits of information. And I knew from the newspaper articles that Pawnee Bill had a baby camel born that he named Lulu after his Shriner temple in Philadelphia. And so I thought, well, sure, they took Lulu the camel's picture with Lulu the cowgirl kind of as a joke. I think it was like 1908. It's one of the earliest pictures of Lulu. Well, then later, next slide, when I went to the Ringling Museum archives to look for photographs, there's the original photograph they used. And of course it is Lulu Bell, and it's documented that it's her and all that. And she's with this silly baby camel. Next slide. Looking for information, when you have somebody that is not as well known, they are often not mentioned at all in this material. So this is a letter. This is the back of the letter from Pawnee Bill in 1935, I think, to Lulu. And it was listed on eBay just as a Pawnee Bill signature. Well, the information it gave was that Lulu Bell had asked for a job, and Pawnee Bill was very politely telling her he didn't have a job for her, which I thought was really sad. But you can't just look under the person you're researching's name. You have to expand it again. Next slide. Some of this material is overseas. She performed over in England and Ireland and France. And so some of these souvenirs are still over there. And this is a postcard from the New Brighton Tower where she performed in 1908, I think. Next slide. Again, this came from England. It's the rodeo handout program from a tour she was in 1924. So it's been sitting over in England. Next slide. This postcard is of Beatrice Brasso Kernan, who was her co-worker who traveled with her to South America and back up north. Well, this slide was, postcard rather, was in Germany. And so you can't, and I've had this in researching other things, you don't want to get too intimidated by foreign languages. Sometimes, this one's easy because it's in English. You can use Google Translate and get enough of a sense of what's going on to make a decision whether the information is helpful, and then follow up with getting translations. I've had friends that have helped me with translations. You don't really have to necessarily spend money to get the information you want. Next slide. Because Lulu was a performer and a celebrity and was involved in the West, there are tons of collectors of Western paraphernalia. And those people were very helpful in putting her story together. This picture is from, originally it was from a collector named Dan Katz. And I found out about Dan from Scott Souther of the Medway Area Historical Association. And Dan bought a whole lot of Lulu Bell Parr stuff. He was interested, I believe, probably in some of the guns she had. And along with it, he got clothing, he got photographs, he got stuff. Now, he donated a lot of it to the National Cowgirl Hall of Fame, but he kept copies or kept some of it and was just very generous and kind and helped me get information. Next slide. These are leather gauntlets. They're at the museum, the National Cowgirl Hall of Fame. And again, museums had a lot of this stuff. They had images. The images were very helpful in illustrating, but also in learning about Lulu Bell's life. I want to say, I did have some dead ends, you know, as I researched, like Circus World. There was COVID closures going on, so I just had to deal with that. I did, I'm just looking at my notes. I'm sorry. I want to make sure I don't miss anything. I want to remind people, you have to revisit places, you have to revisit sources, things get added, you know, digital records get updated. So things are always changing. And next slide. I'm still on the hunt. I'm just interested. Like I said, when I started off researching her, I wasn't sure how much of the story was baloney and how much was true. And the more I learned about Lulu Bell, the more I liked her. as a person. I thought she was very hardworking and dedicated and a decent person. So I'm still interested. I have questions. Like I said, the book, you could go on forever writing about anybody and researching forever, but I felt I had enough information to put together a reasonable view of her life. But the things that I still want to know about is how did she survive in the 30s and 40s? Where did she spend her childhood? I want to know more about that. And when and where did her mother's life end? Her mother worked as a fortune teller, so she's really sketchy as far as finding information. I want to know more about Lulu's work in films. She was in silent films, I know that, but much of that material has been lost for everybody. The early silent films are just not to be found. And I'm interested in her religious beliefs. There was one notation that she at one time considered leaving the Wild West show early on to become a missionary to China. And I want to know about that. So I'm hoping that things surface as the story gets out. And that's, I'm going to open it up for questions. Natalie, you can put the last slide up if you want.
All right. Yeah, so we'll open it up for questions. And but first I just want to say this is fascinating. And I did get to do a lot of little bits of research on various topics, and throughout every week. So a lot of what I'm doing research on is when people like you contact and say, hey, can you help me find something? So I first learned about Lulu because somebody, I think from the Cowgirl Museum, wanted some tidbit of information. And the only thing that I could find in our archives was what we had already, was the story about Medway getting the stone up for her and the article about that and all that stuff from the early 2000s. So, but that gave, helped me learn about somebody new that I was like, well, this is a really interesting person that I didn't know was connected to our area. So I was really excited when you contacted us and found out you were writing this book about her. So
yeah, because you helped me with I was trying to figure out if her mother had gone to a tuberculosis hospital, and you dug up all the old clinic records, the visitation records.
And did we find her? I don't remember.
No. So it was one of those things. It was good. Then I knew she didn't. It was somebody else.
Yeah, and I say you gave a lot of sources just now that I can use as ideas to help people when they come to us for research. I know that newspapers.com has become my best friend as far as changing the game and how research is done, because there's stuff that people could have asked some sort of obscure question that we would have, if we couldn't narrow it down to at least a small span of years, even though we have the newspapers, it would have been something that would have been impossible for us to find for a researcher. But now I probably spend a good chunk of every day of my work days and off days even looking on newspapers.com to find things. And what you were talking about, how you research it, I mean, how you organize it, I think that was really great. And that would help me more. I know that what I love about newspapers.com is that you can save the file name to be the paper and the date and everything. And that's usually how I send it to researchers. And I just tell them, that gives you your answer as to where it came from. But I know that I usually have to go back and remember what I was looking for in the article. So you mentioned that you put it in your title also. Do you still leave the dates in there when you do that in the original source information?
I just name it with Lulu and something. I don't enter any dates, but of course it comes out by dates. And when I search, I have so much stuff that I'll search by decade, when I go back to, does that make sense?
Yeah.
There's a advanced search thing where you can just look at with a date range. So I use date ranges to help me. So I'll look under Lulu and then I'll look 1909 to 1919,
And the Scrivener, that sounds like an amazing source for organizing all of your information. So I'll turn it over to anyone if there's anyone out there that has any questions that they'd like to ask you. You can unmute yourself or you can try and put it in the chat if you'd like.
Okay, Natalie, I've got a couple questions. I've seen the monument down there in Medway, beautiful monument, and I appreciate how they have documented all the bodies that are buried in the cemetery. But how did they determine that she was in an unmarked grave?
How did that come up?
Yes.
Two brothers came. Their name was Parr, and they thought they might be related. They knew she was famous, and they went to the Dayton Historical Society. I think it was 1999, and they were referred to the Medway Area Historical Society Association. And initially, as I understand it, and I think Scott's online, it wasn't in the typical records, but it was in the church records that she had been buried there. Is that what you were asking?
Yeah, because I've recently found my great-great-grandfather who'd been missing for 115 years, and he was in an unmarked grave, and it took me forever to finally connect the fact that back at that point he was in the infirmary, so destitute, that the family was able to bury him, but they didn't necessarily have the funds to put a marker down. And that's what prompted me to go back to the Enon Cemetery and go line by line looking for his name. And there was his name with NS for no stone. And again, he'd been missing for 115 years and people had been looking for him. And it was just tedious repetition, going back, asking questions, that I was able to find him. So I wondered if they had church records or something from which they could say, yes, the person was buried in the cemetery and where the location was.
Yes.
But everything I thought was, like Natalie said, very interesting, and the different places. I'd never heard of the chronicling America. So there's several places I think I'm going to be looking after what you shared with us.
Yeah, you just go to loc.gov, which is libraryofcongress.gov, and it'll say digitized records, I think, on the opening page. And the digitized, it'll show up as a Chronicling America. It's a newspaper.
Okay, perfect.
And well, Patty, I have to tell you, the Chronicling America doesn't include a whole lot of our area newspapers. They have 1880s. They might have more now, but I think you'd have a field day on loc.gov anyway if you just started doing a search for photos or,
Okay.
Diane, you had some really good tips for, branching out on the people that you're searching for. I know that finding anybody's obituary is always very helpful because then you can nail down other people to look into too that can help you tie people together. So your tips about looking into the tree is very helpful also.
No, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Diane, did you find out how she came to be buried in a Mennonite cemetery?
Yeah, well, I have my ideas. Okay. Lower Valley Pike goes through Medway and then continues on and really connects Springfield and Dayton. And her home with her brother was like a block or two off Valley Road. So she was on the northeast side of Dayton, okay, and Medway's in that same area. So it may have been something that they were familiar with. However, the real reason I think is that her brother moved to Dayton in the early 1900s and lived in a neighborhood that was considered the poorest in town at that time, according to some people. And there was a missionary church there. It was United Brethren. And the United Brethren Church has some ties with the Mennonite church, okay? And the minister there, when her brother died and when she died, the minister of that missionary church was the one who gave their funeral, okay? So I believe that they had relationships with that church. And when she died, it was a minister who contacted the authorities that he hadn't seen her. So I think, and she had a big Bible and this and that. So I think she was probably well known to that church. And I would imagine with their ties with the Mennonite, and this is just, I don't know, okay? But I imagine that they might have helped finesse her getting buried there. But she died without any money to cover her burial and or anything.
Okay, thank you.
Does anybody have any other questions or anything? Diane, I have a question about, I mean, what was the most exciting, like, find that you uncovered that you were most excited to see?
Well, I mean, it's a sad one, but the thing that I guess meant the most to me, I always wondered what motivated her, to be a cowgirl. I mean, she's in Steubenville. She's 26 years old, and she runs away and joins the Wild West show. And I thought she always wanted to be a performer. And I thought probably she had, her father had their family had fallen apart very early on. And I thought, well, she just wanted to be like her dad because he was out west. Well, the thing that got me was I knew she had divorced her first husband, but then I found her complaint in the newspaper. And he had, according to her, put a gun to her chest and strangled her and threatened to kill her, And then after they separated, he still lived in the same block. So I think he was a stalker. And and she never went back to Steubenville and he never left. And so to find that, I thought that was probably the instigating factor for her taking off and joining up with Pawnee Bill, because she didn't have a lot of resources. Her mother was a fortune teller. I mean, come on, and her dad was out west somewhere. So that wasn't, it wasn't a happy thing, but it was very interesting to me. And I also found it interesting that she was always sort of like, you barely escaping death, even besides writing. I mean, she was on this ship coming back from South America, and all of a sudden I found this article, and the ship had a fire on it as it pulled by New Jersey going into Brooklyn, I think is where they were going to dock. And they claimed that some immigrant had dropped a match in the explosives in the Wild West materials, some of those target balls. But then there was an alternate explanation that came out later, and it was right before World War I. And there was a guy down in South America who was a famous spy who was blowing up British merchant ships, And so there was claims that he had caused that fire on the Valbin. So, there she is. She's always getting hurt on the horses. I mean, really serious injuries, and barely making it. And then she barely, she just really in some ways led a very charmed life, to make it to 78. So I found that interesting as well.
So is that a picture of you on the last page?
Yeah, that's me. And if you look at that picture, you can see this guy's moccasin. Do you see the green moccasin underneath my chaps? There's a man behind there holding me up, apparently.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Kind of scrunched and, yeah, that's me.
Were you a cowgirl?
I wanted to be, but that's like in Dayton on East 2nd Street, I mean,
yeah.
I was in the city and I could not understand why I couldn't have a horse.
That's a great picture.
Yeah.
Well, Diane, do you want to tell people where they can get your book?
Oh, sure. Well, I wanted to make it widely available, so I did do an audio book. It's kind of crazy being at the library. I don't know if we have power yet at home or not. But anyway, so it's available as an audiobook from Amazon, but it's available as an electronic book, a hard copy, and a soft copy at pretty much anywhere. Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and then independent bookstores can order it.
And Diane, I know we will probably talk to your publisher about, or you about copies that we can have available for purchase at the Heritage Center.
Sure. Yeah, Ingram is the distributor, so it's easy to get it. Okay.
But yeah, that would be great. And I think people would be really interested. It's a really interesting story. And I thank you for sharing how your process. I think that's a unique view to get and And I know the people on this call. I mean, I know Patty's been in my history detectives class, so you just gave her a lot more places to go now. And I know she's excited about that. So
Well, good. And people can email me. I'm happy, you know, to share like the details of some of the software or whatever they need or how I found stuff. Happy to do that. So.
well, if you have any other last things that you want to share, or if anybody has anything else.
Oh, well, thank you for, you know, asking me to do this. I enjoy it. It's nice to speak to people from home, you know, that's always fun. And that was a lot of the fun of looking up Lulu, you know. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing. And our next program that we have, virtual program that we have planned is with another author, Chris Woodyard, the author of the Haunted Ohio books, is going to she's done some historical haunting books that include Springfield. And she's gonna talk about some of those stories and just some of her favorite ghost stories that she has learned and found over the years having to do with Ohio. So she's going to share that in a program towards the end of next month on October 23rd. And to go along with that spooky theme, I don't know if I can get this one to come up. Let's see. The other, I'm not sure if I can. I'd have to share my whole thing there. Nope, it's going right to Canva. Well, you can see it's not working right, but our program coming up this Saturday is a spooky program about that we're going to have stories told throughout the Heritage Center on tours. So you'll get to hear some true sad tales, spooky tales, different things like that on a special tour this Saturday, running between 6 and 9 p.m. People can book tour time. So if you know anyone that would be interested in that, this is our first time trying a spooky tour like this. We've done our night at the museum for many years, and this is kind of a different different side of that. So, and then I was gonna say, I know in the future we'll probably want to bring Lulu's story to someone that we can share in our tours in the museum like that. So
Great.
thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
And we'll see you hopefully at the next thing. So thanks again, Diane, and everybody have a good night.
You too. Bye-bye.